Christopher Blount was carried to the scaffold on a litter while his wounds still bled. He was beheaded for high treason, having taken up arms against the crown. Yet for Queen Elizabeth I, signing the death warrant was also a final bitter blow against her lifelong rival, Lettice Knollys. She executed him to remove a final support, ensuring that her enemy would face a cold, solitary widowhood similar to her own. By that time, Elizabeth I was an aging woman concealing her decay under lead makeup. Driven by political necessity and a lingering personal resentment, she decided to take Blount's life to secure her authority and, perhaps, to level the score. Christopher Blount entered the world around 1555 in Kidderminster, Worcestershire. It was a time when the very soul of England was being torn apart. The country was in a state of violent flux, oscillating between the old Catholic faith and the new Protestant order. Blount was the physical embodiment of this national schizophrenia. His father was Thomas Blount. Thomas was a man of the world, a pragmatist. He was a relative and a servant of the Dudley family. The Dudleys were the rising stars of the Protestant Reformation, the power brokers of the new Elizabethan age. To serve the Dudleys was to align oneself with the future. It meant land, status, and survival. Thomas Blount understood that in England, religion was often just another word for politics. But Christopher's mother, Marjorie Poley, was different. She was a woman of iron conviction. She was a devout Catholic. For her, the Reformation was not progress. It was heresy. She raised her children in a household where the public face was compliant, but the private heart remained loyal to Rome. This was the atmosphere Christopher breathed from infancy, duality. He learned early on that there were two truths. There was the truth you spoke in the marketplace to keep your head, and there was the truth you whispered in the dark to save your soul. He was a younger son. In the brutal economics of the 16th century, this meant he was expendable. The eldest son would inherit the land and the titles. Christopher would inherit only his wits and his connections. He had to forge his own path. His parents made a dangerous decision regarding his education. A standard English gentleman would have been sent to Oxford or Cambridge to learn obedience to the Queen. Christopher was sent across the sea. He was shipped to the Low Countries, to the University of Louvain. Louvain was not merely a university. For a young Englishman in the 1560s and 70s, it was a political statement. It was the gathering place for the Catholic exiles, the intellectuals and priests who had fled Elizabeth's Protestant laws. Here, Blount was not taught how to serve the Queen. He was taught that Elizabeth I was a bastard and a usurper. He was surrounded by the rhetoric of the Counter-Reformation. The priests at Louvain and later at the English College in Douai were training a spiritual army. Their goal was the reconquest of England. They believed that saving English souls required the removal of the English Queen. Blount was an excellent student. He was intelligent, charming, and physically robust. He absorbed the theology. He learned the arguments. He likely attended the Latin Mass daily, praying for the deliverance of his homeland from heresy. But as he grew into manhood, a conflict began to take root in him. The priests at Douai urged their students to return to England as missionaries. This was a suicide mission. To be a Catholic priest in England was high treason. The penalty was to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. Blount looked at his future. He saw two paths. Path one, the martyr. He could smuggle himself back into England, hide in priest holes, say illegal masses, and eventually die a gruesome death at Tyburn for the glory of God. Path two, the survivor. He could use his knowledge, his connections, and his charm to carve out a life of comfort. Christopher Blount was a man of faith, but he was not a man of martyrdom. He liked the world too much. He wanted status. He wanted glory. He wanted to live. However, he had a problem. He was a known Catholic exile. If he returned to England, he would be immediately suspect. He had no fortune. He had no patron. He was walking into a trap. He realized that to survive in a police state, he had to make himself useful to the police. The man who ran England's police state was Sir Francis Walsingham. He was the Queen's principal secretary and her spymaster. Walsingham was a Puritan, a man who wore black and rarely smiled. He believed that there was a vast international Catholic conspiracy to kill Elizabeth, and he was right. Walsingham's power came from information. He had eyes and ears everywhere. He intercepted letters. He broke codes. He knew who was sleeping with whom and who was whispering treason in the alehouses. Sometime in the late 1570s or early 1580s, Christopher Blount came to Walsingham's attention, or perhaps Blount sought him out. The records are murky, hidden in the destroyed archives of the Secret Service. But the result is clear. Walsingham saw potential in Blount. Here was a young man with a perfect pedigree for espionage. He was Catholic. He had been educated at Louvain. He knew the exiles. He was trusted by the enemies of the state. Walsingham offered Blount a deal. Blount could return to England. He could have his freedom. He could even have a career. In exchange, Blount would become an agent. He would inform on the very people who had educated him. Blount accepted. It is easy to judge him, but we must consider the pressure he was under. He was young, penniless, and marked. Walsingham offered him a lifeline. Blount took it, perhaps telling himself that he could play both sides. Perhaps he thought he could feed Walsingham useless information while protecting his true friends. If that was his hope, he was naive. Walsingham did not accept useless information. He demanded results. Blount was sent to Paris. The French capital was the hub of Catholic conspiracy. It was home to the agents of Mary, Queen of Scots, the imprisoned Catholic claimant to the English throne. Blount's mission was to infiltrate the circle of Thomas Morgan and Charles Paget. These were the masterminds of the Catholic underground. They organized the smuggling of letters to Mary. They coordinated with the Spanish ambassadors. They plotted the invasions of England. Blount played his part perfectly. He presented himself as a disillusioned Catholic gentleman burning with hatred for Elizabeth. He used his time at Louvain as a credential. "I am one of you," his presence said. "I have suffered for the faith." Morgan and Paget, usually paranoid, embraced him. Blount was charming. He was eager. He was useful. They began to trust him with their secrets. They gave him letters to carry to London, letters containing names of safe houses, identities of priests, and details of funding. Blount took these letters, he broke the seals, he copied them, and he sent the copies to Walsingham. For several years, Christopher Blount lived a life of high-stakes deception. He sat in candlelit rooms in Paris, drinking wine with men he was systematically monitoring. He looked them in the eye, pledged his loyalty, and then reported on them. This work required a specific psychological toll. It required a man to detach his actions from his conscience. To survive, Blount compartmentalized his life. He told himself he was serving his country, even if it meant betraying his co-religionists. He became one of Walsingham's most effective assets. He was involved in the periphery of the Throckmorton plot. He helped monitor the flow of information between Paris and the captive Queen of Scots. He was a professional operator. But the life of a spy is lonely. It is a life lived in the shadows, where no friendship is real and every conversation is an interrogation. Blount was a man of action, a man of physical vitality. He was tired of reading other men's mail. He was tired of the whispers. He wanted to be a soldier. He wanted to be a knight. He wanted to walk in the sun. By 1584, the stress of the double life was wearing on him. Walsingham was a demanding master, and the pay for spies was notoriously unreliable. Blount looked for an exit strategy. He looked to his father's old connections, the Dudley family. Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, was the most powerful man in England. He was the Queen's favorite, the master of the horse, a titan of the court. He was everything Blount was not: wealthy, Protestant, and openly powerful. Blount used his family connection to petition for a position in Leicester's household. It was a gamble. Leicester was a radical Protestant. If he knew the extent of Blount's Catholic past, he might have rejected him. But Leicester was also a pragmatist. He knew Blount had served Walsingham. He knew Blount was capable, dangerous, and discreet. Leicester needed men like that. He needed men who could handle difficult tasks without asking questions. Leicester hired him. This was the turning point in Christopher Blount's life. He left the direct employ of the Secret Service and entered the service of a great lord. In 1584, Christopher Blount stepped out of the shadowy world of espionage and into the dazzling glare of the Elizabethan court. He had secured a position in the household of Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. This was no ordinary employment. Leicester was the epicenter of English power, the sweet Robin whom Queen Elizabeth I had loved for 30 years. To serve Leicester was to stand adjacent to the throne itself. Blount was appointed Gentleman of the Horse. To modern ears, this sounds like a glorified stable hand. In the 16th century, it was a position of immense logistical and military responsibility. The Master of the Horse, Leicester, was responsible for the Queen's travel, her security on the road, and the breeding of the royal cavalry. As his deputy, Blount was effectively the chief of staff for a paramilitary organization. He managed the Earl's retinue, his travel schedules, his security detail, and his vast stables of war horses. It was a grueling job that required a unique blend of skills: the administrative mind of a clerk and the physical toughness of a soldier. Blount excelled. He proved to be fiercely competent, a quality Leicester valued above all else. The Earl, who was often paranoid and surrounded by sycophants, found in Blount a man who spoke little but accomplished much. Their relationship deepened quickly. In his private correspondence, Leicester began to refer to Blount as Mr. Kit. It was a sign of genuine affection and trust. Blount became the Earl's fixer. When there were debts to be settled quietly or sensitive messages to be delivered to the Queen's ladies without alerting the Queen, Blount was the man. For Blount, this period was a revelation. He was observing the machinery of power from the inside. He saw how Leicester managed the Queen, the flattery, the tantrums, the careful choreography of their romance. He saw the capriciousness of royal favor. He learned that in the Tudor court, you were only as safe as the Queen's mood on any given Tuesday. But Blount was itching for more than domestic service. He was a man of action who had spent his youth in the dark. He wanted to prove his valor in the light. In 1585, history gave him his chance. The war in the Netherlands was England's Vietnam. It was a messy, expensive, and religiously charged conflict. The Protestant Dutch were rebelling against their Catholic overlords, the Spanish Empire. Elizabeth, after years of hesitation, finally agreed to send an army to support the Dutch. She appointed Leicester as the lieutenant general of the expeditionary force. For Leicester, this was the culmination of his life's ambition. He would finally be a great military commander, a Protestant crusader driving the Spanish from northern Europe. He emptied his coffers to outfit a magnificent army. He brought the flower of English nobility with him: his nephew, Sir Philip Sidney, his stepson, Robert Devereux, the young Earl of Essex, and his trusted officer, Christopher Blount. Blount went to war not just as a servant, but as a captain. He was given command of a company of lancers. This was the elite shock cavalry of the day, men in half armor wielding heavy lances designed to smash through infantry formations. The campaign, however, was a disaster of management. The English troops were ill-fed and unpaid. The Dutch allies were suspicious. The Queen, back in London, was furious at the cost and constantly undercut Leicester's authority. The weather was atrocious. The Netherlands was a landscape of mud, freezing rain, and flooded dikes. Amidst the squalor and the political infighting, the army began to rot. Disease killed more men than Spanish bullets. But in this crucible of misery, Christopher Blount thrived. The discipline he had learned in the seminary and the ruthlessness he had learned in the Secret Service made him an effective officer. He kept his men fed. He kept his horses alive. He did not complain. Leicester relied on him increasingly. As other officers bickered or went home, Blount remained steady. He became a bridge between the old guard of Leicester's generation and the young wolves, men like Philip Sidney and the Earl of Essex, who were eager for glory. The defining moment of the campaign and of Blount's life as a soldier came on September 22, 1586. The English forces moved to intercept a Spanish supply convoy headed for the town of Zutphen. It was a foggy morning. The English intelligence was faulty. They expected a small escort. Instead, as the mist lifted, they found themselves facing the main body of the Spanish army. Thousands of musketeers, pikemen, and cavalry, commanded by the brilliant Duke of Parma. The English force, numbering only a few hundred cavalry, should have retreated. Instead, driven by a mixture of chivalric idiocy and genuine bravery, they charged. It was a chaotic, bloody melee. The English knights in their heavy armor crashed into the Spanish lines. Sir Philip Sidney, the golden boy of the Elizabethan age, famously rode into battle without his thigh armor because he saw another officer without his. It was a fatal gesture. He would be struck by a musket ball and die a slow, agonizing death weeks later. But while Sidney was becoming a tragic legend, Christopher Blount was becoming a hero. In the heat of the fight, the English line began to buckle. The Spanish infantry, disciplined and terrifying, were closing in. Sir Francis Vere, one of England's most capable commanders, found himself trapped. His horse was killed under him, and Spanish pikemen were closing in to finish him off. It was a death sentence. Blount saw him. He did not wait for orders. He rallied his small troop of lancers and spurred his horse directly into the swarm of Spanish infantry. It was a suicide run. Blount fought with a terrifying cold aggression. He charged into the enemy lines to relieve the pressure on Vere's position, holding the line long enough for the English to regroup. It was a moment of pure kinetic violence. Blount took a wound, likely the beginning of the injuries that would plague him later. But he didn't stop. The Battle of Zutphen was a strategic defeat for the English, but a moral victory for the men who fought there. They had faced the best army in Europe and held their ground. For his valor on the field, Christopher Blount was knighted. He rose from the mud as Sir Christopher Blount. The Mr. Kit of the household was gone. He was now a belted knight, a man who had spilled blood for the Protestant cause despite his Catholic heart, and a recognized hero of the realm. Blount returned to England in 1587, a changed man. He carried the physical scars of the war and the psychological hardening of command. He was no longer just an employee, he was a confidant. But the world he returned to was shifting. The Spanish Armada was coming. The year 1588 was dominated by the existential threat of invasion. Leicester was put in command of the land forces at Tilbury, tasked with defending London if the Spanish landed. Blount was at his side, organizing the defenses, preparing for the apocalypse. The Armada was defeated, scattered by English fireships and Protestant winds. The nation exhaled. But in the aftermath of the victory, tragedy struck the Dudley household. In September 1588, journeying to Buxton for his health, Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, died of a sudden fever. The shock was seismic. For 30 years, Leicester had been the sun around which the court orbited. His death left a massive vacuum. The Queen was devastated. She locked herself in her chambers for days, refusing to eat or speak, paralyzed by grief for the only man she had ever truly loved. For Christopher Blount, the death was a catastrophe. He had lost his patron, his protector, and his friend. Without Leicester, Blount was just a minor knight with a questionable religious background and no fortune. He was exposed. The logical move would have been to find a new patron quickly, perhaps the Earl of Essex, Leicester's stepson, who was poised to take over his stepfather's role. But Blount did something illogical. He did something that would destroy his career and immortalize his name. He looked at the grieving widow. Lettice Knollys was, by all accounts, a force of nature. She was the granddaughter of Mary Boleyn, sister to Anne Boleyn, making her a cousin to the Queen. She was beautiful, vivacious, and incredibly wealthy. She was also the most hated woman in England, at least in the eyes of Elizabeth I. Decades earlier, Lettice had committed the unpardonable sin. She had secretly married Leicester, stealing him from the Queen. Elizabeth had never forgiven her. She had banished Lettice from court, dubbed her the she-wolf, and vowed to make her life miserable. Now Lettice was a widow for the second time. She was in her late 40s, but her allure was undiminished. She was surrounded by the wreckage of her husband's estate. Leicester had died with massive debts. She needed someone to help her manage the chaos. She needed a man she could trust. She turned to Sir Christopher Blount. They had known each other for years. Blount had served her husband. He had lived in their house. He had been the quiet, efficient presence in the background. But now, the background moved to the foreground. Whatever relationship existed before Leicester's death, and rumors of an affair were rampant, though unproven, it now blossomed into a frantic, intense romance. It was a match that made no sense on paper. Lettice was one of the highest-ranking noblewomen in the land. Blount was a younger son of a minor gentry family. She was wealthy. He was poor. She was older. He was younger. But they shared something profound. They were both outsiders. Lettice was exiled from the court by the Queen's jealousy. Blount was exiled from true acceptance by his Catholic past and his lack of status. They found solace in each other. In the spring of 1589, less than a year after Leicester's death, they made a decision that was as reckless as Blount's charge at Zutphen. They decided to marry. They knew the Queen would be furious. Elizabeth expected her nobility to ask permission to marry, especially when it involved the widow of her favorite. And for Lettice, the hated rival, to marry the late Earl's own servant? It was a scandal designed to humiliate the Queen. They didn't care. They married in secret. When the news broke, the reaction was nuclear. The Queen's rage was not just political. It was personal and vicious. She felt that Blount had betrayed his master's memory and that Lettice was mocking her own grief. While Elizabeth mourned Leicester, Lettice was already sleeping with his retainer. The Queen stripped Blount of any hope of royal favor. She verbally abused him in court. She threatened to ruin them both. But Blount stood firm. He did not apologize. He moved into Lettice's estates at Drayton Bassett. He took on Leicester's debts, spending years paying them off to protect Lettice's reputation. He became a devoted stepfather to her children, particularly the young and volatile Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex. Blount had traded the favor of the Queen for the love of the Queen's enemy. He had made his choice. He was no longer the Queen's man. He was Lettice's husband. And in the eyes of Elizabeth I, that made him a traitor long before he ever picked up a sword against her. After the scandal of his marriage to Lettice Knollys in 1589, Christopher Blount found himself in a strange position. He was a knight of the realm and the husband of a countess, yet he was a pariah at court. The Queen's fury at Lettice, the she-wolf who had stolen her favorite, extended to Blount. They were effectively banished from the royal presence. They retreated to Drayton Bassett, a sprawling estate in Staffordshire. For a man who had lived on the edge of a knife in Paris and the Netherlands, the quiet of the English countryside should have been boring. Instead, it was a revelation. Blount discovered a talent for domestic management. The Earl of Leicester had left the estate in financial ruins. His debts were astronomical. Blount, with the pragmatic mind of an administrator, took charge. He spent the early 1590s negotiating with creditors, selling off minor lands, and restructuring the estate. He wasn't just Lettice's lover, he was her savior. He secured her jointure and ensured she could live in the style to which she was accustomed. Their marriage, born in scandal, hardened into a partnership of iron. They were isolated together. They hunted, they managed the tenants, and they raised a family. Blount became a father figure to Lettice's children from her first marriage. But one child in particular would come to define the rest of Blount's life. Robert Devereux, the second Earl of Essex, was the new son of the English court. He was Lettice's son. He was young, impossibly handsome, and charismatically unstable. He had stepped into his stepfather Leicester's shoes as the Queen's favorite. Elizabeth, now an old woman, was infatuated with him. She indulged his tantrums and forgave his arrogance. Essex was a man who needed a father. His own father had died when he was young. Leicester had been distant. In Christopher Blount, Essex found the steady hand he craved. Blount was only about 10 years older than Essex. They were less like father and son and more like older and younger brothers. But Blount had something Essex lacked: experience. Blount had been a spy. He knew how to keep secrets. He had been a soldier in the mud of Zutphen. He knew the difference between bravery and stupidity. Essex worshipped him. He appointed Blount to his household council. He relied on Blount for military advice. When Essex was at court, navigating the treacherous waters of the Queen's favor, Blount was often at his side or managing his affairs in the country. A dangerous dynamic formed. Blount, the man who had once served the state, began to serve the family. His loyalty shifted. He was no longer working for England. He was working for the House of Essex. He believed that Essex was the future of the country, a Protestant warlord who would smash Spain and restore England's glory. It was a seductive vision. And in 1596, it seemed like it might actually come true. The war with Spain was still grinding on. Essex, hungry for the kind of military glory that would make him untouchable, proposed a daring strike. He wanted to attack the Spanish mainland itself. He targeted the port of Cadiz, the hub of Spanish naval power. It was a massive operation. The English fleet, combined with Dutch allies, sailed in June 1596. Essex was one of the commanders. Christopher Blount went with him. not as a subordinate, but as a colonel of the army. The attack on Cadiz was the high watermark of Elizabethan military achievement. The English fleet smashed the Spanish galleys in the harbor. Then, Essex ordered an amphibious landing. Blount was in the first wave. The English troops hit the sandy beach under heavy fire. They had to scale the walls of the city. It was brutal. Close quarters combat. Blount, now in his 40s, fought with the same ferocity he had shown a decade earlier. He led his regiment through the breach and into the narrow, twisting streets of Cadiz. They sacked the city. It was a complete victory. The Spanish fleet was burned. The city was captured. Essex returned to England as a conquering hero. He walked through London to cheering crowds. He was the reincarnation of Henry V. Blount returned with him, basking in the reflected glory. He was now a colonel, a proven commander, and the right-hand man of the most popular man in England. But victory is a dangerous drug. It made Essex believe his own myth. He began to think he was invincible. He began to treat the Queen not as his sovereign, but as an obstacle. And Blount, blinded by loyalty, did not stop him. The years following Cadiz were a slow slide into disaster. Essex's arrogance alienated the other power players at court, specifically Robert Cecil, the son of Lord Burghley, and Sir Walter Raleigh. These men were cool, calculating bureaucrats. They saw Essex for what he was, a loose cannon. They began to maneuver against him. They blocked his appointments. They whispered in the Queen's ear that Essex was dangerous. Essex responded with rage. He sulked. He turned his back on the Queen in public, a shocking breach of protocol that led to her boxing his ears. He reached for his sword. It was treason, plain and simple, but the Queen forgave him. She always forgave him. Blount watched this with growing unease. He saw the enemies gathering. He advised caution. He urged Essex to stay at court, to manage the Queen. But Essex wanted war. He believed that only on the battlefield could he prove his worth. In 1597, they launched another expedition, this time to the Azores, the island's voyage. It was a failure. They missed the Spanish treasure fleet. They quarreled with Raleigh. They returned home with nothing but debt and sick crews. The pressure on Essex was mounting. He was broke. His reputation was fraying. He needed a win. He needed a war that would silence his critics forever. And then Ireland exploded. Ireland was the bleeding wound of the Elizabethan state. The English had been trying to conquer it for centuries and failing. In 1598, a major rebellion broke out, led by Hugh O'Neill, the Earl of Tyrone. O'Neill was a sophisticated operator. He had been trained in English tactics, he was armed by Spain, and he knew the terrain. At the Battle of the Yellow Ford, O'Neill annihilated an English army. It was the worst defeat England had ever suffered in Ireland. The Queen was terrified. She needed a savior. Essex volunteered. Or rather, he was maneuvered into volunteering by his enemies. Cecil and Raleigh knew that Ireland was a trap. They knew that no English reputation survived the Irish bogs. If Essex went to Ireland, he would likely fail. And if he failed, he was finished. Essex took the bait. He demanded the largest army ever sent from England, 16,000 foot soldiers and 1,300 horse, and he demanded that Christopher Blount come with him. The Queen objected. She did not want Blount in a position of power. She knew he was Essex's creature, but Essex insisted. He refused to go without his stepfather. He appointed Blount the Marshal of the Army, the second in command. In April 1599, they sailed for Dublin. It was a magnificent fleet. They looked like conquerors. But from the moment they landed, everything went wrong. The strategy was simple. march north to Ulster and crush O'Neill. But Essex dithered. He listened to the Irish council in Dublin, who advised him to secure the south first. So the great army marched south. They marched into a nightmare. This was not the open warfare of the Netherlands or the siege warfare of Cadiz. This was guerrilla war. The Irish did not stand and fight. They ambushed. They attacked supply lines. They vanished into the woods and the bogs. It rained constantly. The English troops, clad in wool and heavy armor, began to sicken. Dysentery, the bloody flux, and typhus swept through the camps. Men died by the hundreds, then the thousands. Blount, as marshal, was responsible for discipline and logistics. It was a hopeless task. The food was rotten. The pay didn't arrive. The soldiers were deserting, and Blount himself began to break. He was 44 years old. The old wound from Zutphen flared up. Then, during a skirmish near Arklow, he was shot again. A musket ball tore into his leg. It was a severe wound. The surgeons could not remove the ball. Infection set in. Blount was confined to a litter, carried through the rain-soaked hills of Leinster, delirious with pain. Pain has a way of stripping away pretenses. Lying in his tent, listening to the rain and the screams of dying men, Christopher Blount underwent a spiritual crisis. He had spent 20 years pretending. He had pretended to be a loyal Protestant. He had fought for a Protestant queen against Catholic Spain. He had served a Protestant earl. But in the misery of Ireland, the mask slipped. He saw the futility of his ambition. He saw that he was dying for a queen who hated him. He began to openly revert to the faith of his childhood. He stopped attending the Protestant services. He spoke with a few Catholic priests who moved in the shadows of the camp. He made it known that he was a man of the old religion. It was a dangerous admission, even in Ireland. But Blount no longer cared. He was a soldier at the end of his tether. By late summer 1599, the English army was a wreck. They had lost thousands of men without fighting a single major battle. O'Neill was still untouched in the north. The Queen was sending furious letters from London demanding to know why Essex was wasting her money. Essex panicked. He realized he had walked into Cecil's trap. He was losing his army and he was losing his mind. He began to talk of treason. In a tent in the English camp, Essex called a secret council of his inner circle. Blount was there, propped up on pillows, his leg bandaged. Essex proposed a mad plan. He would take the remaining elite troops, about 3,000 men, and sail back to England. He would land in Wales, march on London, and remove his enemies from the Queen's council by force. It was a coup. The other officers were hesitant. They looked to Blount. As the marshal and the elder statesman of the group, his voice carried the most weight. Blount looked at his stepson. He saw the desperation in Essex's eyes. He knew that if they marched on London with an army, it would be civil war. The Queen would fight. Blood would run in the streets. No, Blount said. He argued against the invasion. He told Essex it was madness. He said the army was too weak and the people would not rise. He proposed a compromise. Essex should go back to England, but alone. He should go with a small retinue, rush to the Queen, and explain himself before his enemies could destroy him completely. It was the advice of a loyal friend trying to save Essex from himself. It was prudent. It was sensible. It was also the worst advice he could have given. If Essex had stayed in Ireland, he might have eventually defeated O'Neill or negotiated a better peace. If he had invaded with an army, he might have actually won the throne or died trying. But by going back alone without an army, he was stripping himself of all leverage. He was walking into the lion's den naked. But Essex listened to Blount. He negotiated a hasty truce with O'Neill, a truce that looked suspiciously like surrender, and abandoned his post. In September 1599, Essex and Blount boarded a ship for England. They left the army behind. They sailed for the court, believing that the Queen's love for Essex would save them. They were wrong. The Queen was not a lover anymore. She was a monarch who had been disobeyed. Christopher Blount limped onto the ship, his leg throbbing, his heart heavy. He was leaving the war, but he was sailing toward his execution. The return of the Earl of Essex and Sir Christopher Blount to England in September 1599 was less a homecoming and more an invasion of privacy. They rode hard from the coast, changing horses constantly, desperate to reach the Queen before their enemies could poison her mind against them. They arrived at Nonsuch Palace at 10 in the morning on September 28th. In his panic, Essex violated the strictest protocol of the court. He burst into the Queen's private bedchamber before she was dressed. Elizabeth I was an old woman without her wig, her makeup, or her royal gown. She was vulnerable, and there stood Essex covered in the mud of the road, smelling of horse sweat and exhaustion. For a moment the shock worked. She welcomed him. She listened to his rambling explanation of the truce with O'Neill. But once Essex left the room to clean himself up, the reality set in. The Queen's advisors, Cecil, Raleigh, and the Cobham faction, went to work. They pointed out the obvious. Essex had disobeyed a direct order. He had abandoned his army. He had made a humiliating peace with a rebel, and he had stormed into the Queen's bedroom like a madman. By the afternoon, the temperature had dropped to freezing. Essex was ordered to remain in his rooms. He was interrogated by the Privy Council. He was stripped of his command. Christopher Blount fared no better. As the Marshal of the Army, he was technically responsible for the discipline of the troops. By leaving them leaderless in Ireland, he had committed a grave dereliction of duty. He was arrested and confined. For weeks they were kept apart. The Queen was furious. She felt betrayed not just by a general, but by a man she had treated as a son. And Blount, the man who was supposed to be the steady hand, the wise counselor, was seen as an enabler of Essex's worst impulses. Essex was eventually released from custody but placed under house arrest at Essex House on the Strand. He was banned from court. He was stripped of his offices. But the cruelest blow came in the summer of 1600. The source of Essex's wealth was a monopoly on sweet wines. It was a royal grant that allowed him to collect taxes on every barrel of sweet wine imported into England. It was up for renewal. Essex wrote pathetic letters to the Queen, begging for the renewal. He told her he was the poor earl, her shag, her humble servant. Elizabeth's response was icy. An ungovernable beast must be stopped of his provender, she reportedly said. She refused to renew the monopoly. Essex was ruined. He was deeply in debt. He had a vast household of soldiers, poets, and hangers-on to support. Without the wine tax, he could not pay them. His credit collapsed. At Drayton Bassett, Christopher Blount watched the slow destruction of his stepson. He had been released from confinement, but he was a marked man. He was suffering from his leg wound, which refused to heal properly. He was in constant pain, walking with a cane or being carried in a chair. He saw what the Queen was doing. She was not just punishing Essex, she was dismantling him. She was destroying his identity as a great lord. Blount faced a choice. He could cut his losses. He could retire to the country, live quietly with Lettice, and let Essex sink. He was 45 years old, broken in body and tired of war. But Blount was incapable of abandoning his family. He believed in the code of the soldier. You do not leave a man behind. And he believed with a fanatic certainty that Essex was the victim of a conspiracy by Robert Cecil. So he returned to London. He moved into Essex House. He became the gatekeeper of the fallen Earl. As 1600 turned into 1601, Essex House became a dangerous place. It was filled with angry young men, swordsmen, disaffected officers from the Irish campaign, and religious radicals. They fed Essex's paranoia. They told him the people loved him. They told him the Queen was being held hostage by Cecil and Raleigh. They told him he had to act. Blount became the organizer of this chaotic energy, and he played his most dangerous card, his religion. Blount knew that the Protestant gentry were not enough to overthrow the government. He needed allies. He reached out to the Catholic underground. He used his old connections from his days as a spy. He contacted Catholic leaders, hinting that if Essex took power, he would grant toleration to Catholics. It was a desperate gamble. Essex was a staunch Protestant hero. If it became known that he was conspiring with papists, his support would evaporate. But Blount didn't care. He was looking for numbers. He was looking for swords. By January 1601, the talk at Essex House had turned from grievances to treason. They were discussing a coup. On Tuesday, February 3rd, 1601, the inner circle met at Drury House, the home of the Earl of Southampton, Essex's best friend and Shakespeare's patron. There were 5 key conspirators: Southampton, Sir Charles Danvers, Sir John Davis, John Littleton, and Sir Christopher Blount. They laid a map of Westminster Palace on the table. They discussed the plan. Plan A? Seize the court. They would infiltrate the palace with small groups of men. Blount would seize the gate. Danvers would take the Great Hall. Davis would secure the guard chamber. Then Essex would enter the Queen's presence, fall on his knees, and rescue her from her evil counselors. Plan B, raise the city. They would march into London, rally the citizens, and storm the palace with a mob. Blount argued for Plan A. It was a soldier's plan, precise, targeted, and relying on surprise. He knew that relying on a mob, Plan B, was suicide. Mobs are unpredictable. But Essex dithered. He couldn't decide. He wanted to be loved, not just feared. He wanted the people to carry him to power. While they argued, the government struck. On Saturday, February 7th, the Privy Council summoned Essex to appear before them. They knew something was happening. The spies were everywhere. Essex refused to go. He claimed he was ill, but he knew the game was up. If he went to the council, he would be arrested and sent to the Tower. He had run out of time. That night, Essex made the fatal decision. He would go with Plan B. He would march on the city. Sunday morning broke cold and gray. Essex House was buzzing. About 200 men had gathered in the courtyard. They were a motley crew, noblemen in silk doublets, old soldiers in rusty armor, and young idealists. At 10 a.m., a knock came at the gate. It was the Lord Keeper Egerton, the Lord Chief Justice Popham, and 2 other high officials. They had come from the Queen to demand an explanation. Essex let them in. The crowd in the courtyard surged around them, shouting, "Kill them! Throw them in the river!" Essex made a catastrophic mistake. He locked the Queen's messengers in his library as hostages. He thought this would buy him time. Instead, it turned a protest into an act of open war. "To the city," Essex cried. "For the Queen, for the Queen. A plot is laid for my life." They marched out of the gates and headed east toward the city of London. Christopher Blount rode at Essex's side. He was in agony from his leg, but he kept his seat. He was armed with a sword and a pistol. They expected the citizens to pour out of the churches and join them. Essex was popular in London. He was their hero. But as they marched down Fleet Street and up Ludgate Hill, a strange thing happened. The people came out. Yes, they watched. They cheered, tentatively. But no one joined. The Sheriff of London, Thomas Smythe, had promised Essex 1,000 men. When Essex arrived at Smythe's house, he found it empty. The sheriff had fled out the back door. The reality hit them like a physical blow. The city was not rising. The government had already sent heralds to every square, proclaiming Essex a traitor. The citizens of London were practical people. They liked Essex, but they were not going to die for him against the Queen. By early afternoon, the rebellion was dead in the water. Essex, sweating and frantic, realized he was alone. He ordered a retreat back to Essex House. He hoped to use the hostages to negotiate a pardon, but the way back was blocked. At Ludgate, the western entrance to the city, the Bishop of London had organized a blocking force. A company of pikemen and musketeers, commanded by Sir John Levison, held the gate. Essex's rabble halted. They were trapped between the silent city behind them and the Queen's Pike wall in front of them. This was the moment Christopher Blount had been waiting for. The politics were over. The speeches were done. Now it was just a tactical problem. He saw the line of musketeers. He knew that if they hesitated, the rebellion would dissolve into a panic. Someone had to break the line. Blount drew his sword. "Charge!" he screamed. He spurred his horse straight at the pikes. It was Zutphen all over again. He wanted to smash through by sheer force of will. He cut down the first man in his path. But this wasn't a battlefield in Flanders. It was a narrow London street. The musketeers leveled their weapons. A shot rang out. The ball struck Blount in the face. It smashed into his cheek, shattering the bone and lodging near his ear. The impact knocked him backward out of his saddle. He hit the cobblestones hard. Another shot took his page, young Henry Tracy, killing him instantly. Blount lay in the street, blinded by blood, drifting in and out of consciousness. The charge collapsed. Essex, seeing his stepfather fall, lost his nerve. He turned and fled down to the river, taking a boat back to Essex House. Blount was left behind. He was captured by the Queen's men, dragged into a nearby house and thrown onto a bed. The surgeon who examined him said the wound was mortal. He was dying. Back at Essex House, the Earl burned his papers. He prepared for a siege, but the Queen's artillery arrived and began to batter the walls. It was hopeless. That evening, Essex surrendered. He and Southampton were led away to the Tower of London. Christopher Blount did not go to the Tower immediately. He was too weak to be moved. He lay under guard, his head wrapped in bloody bandages, listening to the bells of London ringing in triumph. For the Queen, he had failed. He had not saved Essex. He had not restored his family. He had led a charge into nothing. In the silence of his pain, the interrogators came. They wanted names. They wanted to know about the Catholic connection. They wanted to know if he had planned to kill the Queen. Blount, believing he was on his deathbed, began to talk. He had nothing left to lose. Or so he thought. Sir Christopher Blount did not die in the street. He was carried bleeding and unconscious into a nearby house and later transferred to the gatehouse of Lambeth Palace. The surgeon who examined him found a catastrophic injury. The musket ball had shattered his cheekbone, destroyed his eye socket, and lodged deep within his skull. Combined with the festering wound in his leg from Ireland, he was a wreck of a man. The government assumed he would be dead by morning. But Blount possessed a terrifying vitality. He woke up, he lingered, and then the questions began. The Queen's Privy Council sent their heavy hitters to interrogate him, Lord Admiral Nottingham and Robert Cecil. They didn't care about his pain. They needed evidence to execute the Earl of Essex. They needed Blount to confess that the rebellion wasn't just a riot, but a premeditated plot to seize the crown. Blount, delirious with fever and believing he was on his deathbed, made a fatal error. He talked. He admitted that there had been a plan to seize the court. He admitted that he had advised Essex to bring the army from Ireland back in 1599. He admitted that they had discussed using force to change the government. He thought he was giving a soldier's confession before meeting his maker. In reality, he was signing his stepson's death warrant. His testimony was the smoking gun Cecil needed. It transformed Essex from a misguided favorite into a calculating traitor. When Essex was confronted with Blount's confession in the Tower, he collapsed. He felt betrayed by the one man he trusted. In his own despair, Essex then turned on everyone, naming his sister, his friends, and even Blount himself as the architects of his ruin. The bond of brotherhood was severed by the executioner's quill before the axe ever fell. On Ash Wednesday, February 25th, Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, was led out to a private scaffold inside the walls of the Tower of London. He was 34 years old. He wore black velvet and satin. He made a long, pious speech apologizing for his great sin. He was beheaded with 3 strokes of the axe. Christopher Blount, lying in his cell nearby, would have heard the muffled thud of the cannon announcing the death. The boy he had raised, the commander he had followed into the fire at Cadiz and the mud of Ireland, was gone. Blount had failed in his primary mission, to protect Lettice's son. Now he was alone, and he was not dying fast enough. The government decided that Blount, too, must face a public trial. They wanted to make an example of him. He was the martial man, the experienced soldier who should have known better. They needed to show that even heroes of the realm could not touch the Queen's authority. The trial of Sir Christopher Blount and his fellow conspirators, Sir Charles Danvers, Sir John Davis, and Sir Gellie Merrick, was a piece of meticulously staged theater. It was held in Westminster Hall, the cavernous heart of English justice. The crowd that packed the hall saw a pathetic sight. Blount could not walk. He could not even stand. He was carried in on a litter, a bundle of bandages and blankets. His head was wrapped in linen to cover the ruin of his face. He was in such agony that the judges allowed him to remain lying down during the proceedings. The outcome was never in doubt. The charge was high treason. The evidence, his own confession, was damning. But Blount did not beg. When asked why he had taken up arms against the Queen, he did not claim insanity or ignorance. He spoke the simple, devastating truth. "I loved the Earl," he said, his voice weak but steady, "and I could not leave him in his distress." It was a defense that had no standing in law, but it resonated with the code of chivalry. He was saying that his loyalty to his kin outweighed his loyalty to his sovereign. In the eyes of the law, this was treason. In the eyes of the old feudal order, it was honor. The Lord Chief Justice Popham was unimpressed. He sentenced Blount to the full horror of a traitor's death, to be hanged, cut down while still alive, his bowels drawn out and burned before his eyes, and his body quartered. Blount received the sentence without flinching. "My lord," he said, "I do not fear death, for I have faced it often. But I pray you, let me have a soldier's death." He asked for the axe. Queen Elizabeth I was now in the final act of her reign. She was old, lonely, and hardening. She had killed her favorite, Essex. Now she had to decide what to do with his stepfather. There were calls for mercy. Blount was a war hero. He was a knight. He was severely wounded. Executing a dying man seemed cruel, even for the Tudors, but Elizabeth refused to pardon him. Her reasoning was likely personal. She knew that Lettice Knollys, the hated she-wolf, was waiting at Drayton Bassett. Lettice had just lost her son. If Blount were spared, Lettice would still have a husband. She would have a shoulder to cry on. She would have a future. Elizabeth could not abide that. She wanted Lettice to be utterly destroyed. She wanted her rival to die as she herself would die, alone. However, the Queen did grant one concession. She commuted the sentence from hanging and quartering to simple beheading. It was a nod to Blount's rank and his service at Zutphen and Cadiz. It was a soldier's death, as he had asked. The date was set for March 18th, 1601. The morning of March 18th was cold and damp. A massive crowd gathered at Tower Hill. Public executions were the reality TV of the 17th century, and this was a season finale. They wanted to see the last of the Essex rebels die. Sir Charles Danvers died first. He met his end with quiet dignity. Then it was Blount's turn. The sheriff's men went to his cell. They found him unable to move. The wound in his leg had seized up. The wound in his head was throbbing. He had to be lifted by two yeomen and practically dragged to the scaffold. When he appeared, a silence fell over the crowd. This was not the dashing cavalier of the tilt yard. This was a broken man, gray-faced and trembling with pain. But as he reached the platform, he straightened his back. He refused to be carried to the block. He asked for a stool. He sat down, breathing heavily, and looked out at the sea of faces. In the front row, he saw a familiar face, Sir Walter Raleigh. Raleigh was the captain of the guard, the man who had destroyed Essex, the man whose soldiers had shot Blount in the face. He was smoking a pipe, watching the proceedings with his usual detached arrogance. Blount beckoned him. "Sir Walter," he called out. The crowd held its breath. Would he curse him? Would he spit on him? Raleigh stepped closer. Blount looked him in the eye. "Sir Walter," he whispered, "I ask your pardon. I meant you no harm. I was blinded by my love for the Earl." It was an extraordinary moment. In the shadow of the axe, Blount chose forgiveness over vengeance. Raleigh, perhaps moved, perhaps just polite, nodded and wished him peace. Blount then turned to the business of dying. The Protestant chaplain, Dr. Montford, stepped forward to lead him in prayer. He expected Blount to recite the standard Anglican confession. Blount raised his hand. "No," he said firmly. He looked at the crowd. "I die in the faith of my fathers," he announced. "I am a Catholic." A ripple of shock went through the audience. To admit to being a Catholic on the scaffold was to die a double traitor. It denied the Queen's spiritual authority in her final moments. But Blount was done with hiding. He had been a spy, a double agent, a church papist, and a liar for 20 years. Now at the very end he stripped away the last mask. He began to pray in Latin, Pater Noster, Ave Maria. He prayed for the Queen. He prayed for his wife, that poor lady, Lettice. He prayed for his soul. Then he struggled to his feet one last time. He removed his doublet. The cold air hit his skin. He forgave the executioner and gave him a gold coin. He knelt in the straw. It was difficult. His bad leg would not bend. He had to sprawl awkwardly across the block. He stretched out his neck. "Lord, receive my spirit," he said. The executioner swung the axe. It was a clean blow. The head of Sir Christopher Blount fell into the straw. The crowd did not cheer. They dispersed in silence, unsettled by the sight of a hero brought so low. In death, as in life, he remained the loyal lieutenant, guarding his master in the dark. While the axe was falling on Tower Hill, a terrible silence had descended upon Drayton Bassett in Staffordshire. This was the home of Lettice Knollys. She was 57 years old, a woman who had once been the toast of the court, the she-wolf who had dared to rival the Queen. Now she was a figure of Greek tragedy. In the span of 22 days, she had lost everything that mattered. On February 25th, 1601, she received the news that her son, the Earl of Essex, her sweet Robin, had been beheaded. Before she could even process that grief, the news arrived on March 20th that her husband, Sir Christopher Blount, had followed him to the grave. The cruelty of the timing was absolute. Elizabeth I had not just executed two traitors, she had systematically dismantled Lettice's life. By killing the son, she destroyed Lettice's legacy. By killing the husband, she destroyed Lettice's present comfort. Lettice did not wail. She did not tear her clothes. She did what women of her station were trained to do. She endured. But the legal consequences of Blount's treason were immediate and brutal. Under the laws of attainder, a traitor forfeited all his property to the crown. Christopher Blount had been the legal owner of Lettice's dower lands, the income left to her by the Earl of Leicester. With his conviction, the Queen's officers technically had the right to seize everything. Lettice found herself not only widowed but facing destitution. The sheriff's men arrived at Drayton Bassett to inventory the goods. They counted the silver, the tapestries, and the horses. They were preparing to strip the house bare. It was the final twist of the knife. The Queen was not content with Blount's head. She wanted his widow's bed and board. Lettice Knollys was many things, but she was not a victim. She had survived the wrath of Henry VIII's daughter for 30 years. She was not going to let Christopher Blount's death be the end of her. She began a frantic legal campaign. She wrote letters to Robert Cecil, the very man who had engineered the downfall of her son and husband. It was a humiliation, begging the architect of her ruin for mercy. But Lettice swallowed her pride. She argued that the lands were hers, not Blount's. She argued that she was an innocent party. She played the poor, desolate widow card with consummate skill. Surprisingly, it worked. Cecil, perhaps feeling a pang of guilt, or perhaps simply wanting to stabilize the realm now that his enemies were dead, intervened. He persuaded the Queen to stop the seizure of Lettice's goods. Elizabeth agreed, but with a caveat. She allowed Lettice to keep her personal property, but she refused to restore the full value of Blount's estate. She wanted Lettice to struggle. She wanted her to feel the pinch of reduced circumstances. For the next 2 years, Lettice lived in a kind of internal exile. She did not go to London. She did not go to court. She stayed in Staffordshire, managing her diminished estates, surrounded by the ghosts of the two men she had loved most. Back in London, the victory over the Essex faction began to taste like ash. Elizabeth had secured her throne, but she had lost the heart of her court. The execution of Essex and Blount had solved the immediate political crisis, but it created a psychological void. The Queen was old. She was nearly 70. Her generation, Burghley, Leicester, Walsingham, was dead. And now she had killed the leading lights of the next generation. Reports from the court in late 1601 and 1602 paint a picture of a monarch in decline. Elizabeth became moody and withdrawn. She was often seen sitting in the dark, staring at nothing. Sir John Harrington, her godson, visited her and wrote that she was much altered in her attire and visage. She carried a rusty sword and would thrust it into the tapestries, as if fearing assassins. The ghost of Essex haunted her. She reportedly kept the ring he had sent her, or tried to send her, before his death. She spoke of him often, sometimes with anger, sometimes with tears. And what of Blount? His name was rarely spoken. He was the collateral damage of the tragedy, but his absence was felt. The martial men, the soldiers, who had looked to Essex and Blount for leadership, were sullen. They felt the Queen had betrayed the military caste. The clamor of the Elizabethan age was fading. In March 1603, exactly 2 years after Christopher Blount's execution, the Queen's health collapsed. She refused to go to bed. She stood for hours, leaning on a stick, afraid that if she lay down she would never get up. She died on March 24th, 1603. It was the end of an era. The Tudor dynasty, which had begun on the battlefield of Bosworth in 1485, ended in a quiet room at Richmond Palace. As the Queen took her final breath, a rider was already galloping north to Scotland. He carried a sapphire ring to King James VI of Scotland. The new king was coming. For Lettice Knollys, the death of Elizabeth was a liberation. The woman who had hated her, who had banished her, and who had executed her husband was gone. The new king, James I, had been an ally of Essex. He had corresponded with Essex and Blount in secret. He regarded them not as traitors, but as martyrs for his cause. The wheel of fortune was turning again. When James I arrived in London, one of his first acts was to rehabilitate the memory of the Essex faction. He released the Earl of Southampton from the Tower. He restored the titles of Essex's son, the young Robert Devereux, the third Earl, and he did not forget Christopher Blount. Though Blount could not be brought back to life, his reputation was scrubbed clean. The traitor label was quietly forgotten. The king spoke of him as a brave soldier who had been misled. Lettice Knollys was welcomed back to court. It was a surreal moment. After decades of banishment, the she-wolf was suddenly a revered matriarch. She walked the halls where she had once been whispered about. She saw the new king praising the men Elizabeth had killed, but it was a hollow victory. The rehabilitation could restore titles and lands, but it could not restore flesh and blood. Lettice was vindicated, but she was still alone. She did not remarry. She had had two great loves, Robert Dudley and Christopher Blount. There would not be a third. She devoted the rest of her life to her grandchildren and to the memory of the men she had lost. Lettice Knollys lived on, and on, and on. She survived Christopher Blount by 33 years. She lived through the entire reign of James I. She lived to see Charles I take the throne. She lived to see her grandson, the third Earl of Essex, become a leading general in the parliamentarian army, fighting against the king, just as his father had tried to do. She became a living legend, a relic of a bygone age. People would come to see her just to look at a woman who had known Henry VIII, who had been the cousin of Elizabeth, and who had been the wife of the great Leicester and the brave Blount. She died on Christmas Day, 1634. She was 91 years old. She left instructions to be buried at Warwick in the Beauchamp Chapel. She was laid to rest next to her first husband, the Earl of Leicester. But in her will and in the quiet corners of her heart, she remembered Blount. He was the man who had stood by her when the world hated her. He was the man who had died trying to save her son. How should we judge Sir Christopher Blount? He was not a great man in the traditional sense. He was not a brilliant politician like Cecil, nor a genius like Raleigh. He was a man of the second rank, a younger son, a spy, a cavalry officer. But his life offers a perfect cross-section of the Elizabethan age. He embodied the religious confusion of the time, oscillating between the Catholic faith of his mother and the Protestant service of the state. He embodied the brutal ambition of the court, where men clawed their way up from obscurity only to fall from the heights. Most of all, he embodied the fatal flaw of the Elizabethan male, the belief that honor was more important than survival. Blount could have stayed in Ireland. He could have abandoned Essex in 1599. He could have stayed home on the day of the rebellion. He could have saved himself a dozen times. He chose not to. He chose to ride into the fire because that is what his code demanded. He was a man who defined himself by his loyalties to his wife, to his stepson, and to his friends. In the end, Sir Christopher Blount was a man who played a game he was not ruthless enough to win. He was a soldier trying to navigate a world of spies and lawyers. He tried to be a knight in an age that was rapidly running out of chivalry. His story is a tragedy, but it is not a mystery. He told us exactly who he was on the scaffold. When he looked at Raleigh and asked for pardon, and when he looked at the crowd and claimed his Catholic faith, he was finally, after 45 years of Mass, showing his true face. He was Christopher Blount, and he was faithful unto death.